Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We are just going to give a minute or so for everyone to hop on and our speakers as well. All right, I'm going to get us started, and we're actually going to start with Danielle Torain. But before we get into that, hi, my name is Yinka Bode-George. I'm a public policy and program manager for the Maryland Philanthropy Network. We are a grant maker association across the state of Maryland. Though I will say that a majority of our foundation members, about 50% actually, they reside or focus their giving in Baltimore City. So it's really great to be here in conversation about data, philanthropy, and the Baltimore City community. So I just want to thank the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance for having us and convening this discussion. It's really great to be here in partnership with you all as well. So thank you to the team. So why are we here today? We will be discussing how philanthropy is using data to shape how they prioritize their grant making during this crisis and beyond this crisis. So some of the questions we're going to be asking ourselves and the panelists is, how is philanthropy using data to collaborate during this crisis and beyond? And how is philanthropy using data to advance racial equity during this crisis and beyond? And I'm sure some of you are seeing a poll pop up. Feel free to fill it out so we can gauge some information here. So while you're doing that, I'm just gonna provide a little bit of a grounding before we dive into our discussion and you know, before we allow our panelists to introduce themselves. So I want to talk about race, liberation, and data use because I think that they are so well connected and it's important to really understand and frame those connections. So many people describe this COVID-19 crisis as laying bare the underlying inequities that plague our communities. And simultaneously, the crisis of police brutality has led to a global uprising and calls to action. Baltimore City is not new to such uprisings and calls to action for Black lives. Actually, this year marks the 5th anniversary of the Baltimore uprising following the murder of Freddie Gray. I want to provide a definition of race that I'm borrowing from the People's Institute of Survival and Beyond because it really contextualizes the systemic nature of it. I have some tweaks on it, but it's really, thank you to the People's Institute for this great definition. So race, a false classification system created by white Europeans during a time of worldwide colonization to assign human worth and social status, using themselves as the model of humanity and power to legitimize, standardize, and normalize white power and white privilege. So I also want to offer a definition of white supremacy. I'm again borrowing this time from an excellent workshop led by Eric Jackson, who's the servant leader of the Black Yield Institute. So white supremacy creates terror, domination, pathology, and exploitation. So as we get started, I want to focus on that pathology aspect of white supremacy. So starting with the wonderful Danielle Torain, and I'll allow you to just give a brief introduction of yourself. There should be linked in the chat box a longer description of our panelists and their bios. But so data is included in this culture of white supremacy. And you know, that our communities are steeped in. We know that our worldviews shape the questions we ask and subsequently the science that follows those questions. Danielle, could you first introduce yourself by saying your name? Well, your name is already here, but the organization you work for and your title, and discuss how you use data in your grant making to advance racial equity in our communities. and then how you take into account the ways that data is produced in this white supremacy culture.
So Yinka, first I want to just thank you and everyone behind the scenes for actually hosting this important dialogue. I think that it is so important and so timely given everything that is happening around the city and the ways in which, quite honestly, investment strategy and grant making strategy is evolving, and the questions that we all have as funders presently around who we invest in, where we invest, our practices and things like that. And so this conversation is really on point and timely. I just want to thank you guys for that. I'm Danielle Torain for our audience. I am the director of the Open Society Institute, our Baltimore office. We are actually the only US field office of the Open Society Foundations, which is actually a part of a global network. What I thought I could do in a way of opening comments is actually respond in a way of sharing a few quick overviews of a few bodies of work that actually represent a few examples of how philanthropy can leverage its investment capability, its convening power, and other capabilities to actually support this work around data, data collection, data access, and data as a driver for local decision making. So actually I'm going to share four kind of different examples at a pretty high level, and perhaps we can revisit these examples in our conversation. So one example is the Blueprint for Baltimore, which is a body of work that OSI began to invest in a few years ago. It actually became the largest issue-oriented survey in Baltimore. So through the Blueprint, about 5,000 residents across the city actually participated with over 4,800 responses. And the goal of this particular effort was to work in partnership, or actually through the leadership of local organizers, to support their capacity to engage residents across the city in discussions about the issues that matter most to them and the issues that they want to see most prioritized in the upcoming election cycles. So there was a diverse coalition of different partners, including Baltimore Votes, Black Girls Vote, Black Leaders Organizing for Change, CASA, No Boundaries Coalition. There were also about 40 other community leaders, community champions that joined in this effort in various capacities as well. So that particular effort resulted in a report. The data is actually publicly accessible through partnership with the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance. This particular effort, the Blueprint, is actually a great example of how funders are investing to support the capacity of leaders on the ground to engage others, to lift up priorities that not only can shape the electoral process, but then the information that has been gathered through the Blueprint is actually driving a lot of the decision-making of a lot of other institutions. So that's one example, which is the Blueprint. The other example that I actually want to lift up is that of the Baltimore Children and Youth Fund. I lift that up because actually many of our panelists, we have a history of working together on the early phases of the Youth Fund's design. Another way that we use data, or should use and can use data as investors, is in actually shaping the design of our institutions. And that actually becomes more and more relevant as we continue to think locally about new and creative and innovative and more culturally responsive ways of designing philanthropic institutions to truly be responsive to the wishes and needs of our communities. In that case, BCYF actually hosted a series of community design sessions, about 6 design sessions in community locations, and all of those sessions were open to the public and invited folks to not only share their take on what the potential priorities of the institution may be, but also their take on what it actually should look like to interact with a philanthropic and what that relationship should look like. That's an example of the ways that data can be used as a powerful tool to actually shape the design of philanthropic institutions. The last 2 examples that I'll lift up are actually about bringing, actually thinking in new and different ways about who actually has a power to be a researcher or an evaluator, and ways of democratizing access to the field of research, and getting back to the heart of research, which is inquiry, which is endemic to all of who we are as people, and as a core function of any or a core element of any community's well-functioning community's infrastructure. So in one project, we actually supported, and this is through the Casey Foundation, supported young organizers, young leaders to actually serve as consultants to drive a process of thinking about economic development and workforce development strategy in the city. So this was about changing how we were actually thinking about who can be hired in these positions and should be hired in these positions. That body of work also connects to a larger movement, I think, nationally, to really push for the diversification of the field of research, which is really important, and I hope something that we'll talk about. Like, again, who has the power to collect data? Who has the power to shape the how we even think about data and the terminology that we use? And then what are the mechanisms by which we share information and support folks in actually applying use of that information? So these are very different contexts, but in all of these examples, philanthropy had a role either as an investor, as a recipient of the information, as a student, and then also as in terms of like shaping what we do, how we do it, and the type of organizational design that we're even contemplating in terms of philanthropy. So Yinka, I hope that that responds to your question in terms of, you know, a few different ways that we think about use of data in this context.
Yes, thank you. And welcome to our other panelists, Jamye Wooten and John Brothers. I have the question that I just posed to Danielle in the chat. I hope you both can see it. Who wants to go next? Jamye, would you like to offer some of your thoughts, or John?
Sure, I was trying to see this question.
I'm also happy to.
Yeah, if you, Yinka, could you, I'm trying to find it, and I'm sorry for joining in late under technical difficulties, but could you say it again, and I can answer after that.
So data is included in this culture of white supremacy that our communities are steeped in. We know that our worldviews shape the questions we ask and subsequently the science that follows those questions. If you could just start by introducing your name, your title, your organization, and how you use data in your grant making to advance racial equity in our communities, and then how you take into account the ways that data is produced in this culture of white supremacy. And Danielle
Jamye,
really
I could go.
did a great job of, sorry, go ahead.
Danielle always does a good job of, and I'm glad she started. Jamye, are you okay with me starting, or do you want to go?
No, go ahead, feel free. Good.
Okay. So, well, first, I'm John Brothers with the T. Rowe Price, and I lead T. Rowe Price's philanthropic efforts. Yinka, I hope it's okay. I'm going to get a little bit historical. So I think it's important to note that the current way that the nonprofit sector approaches data is hundreds of years in the making. And so if we look at the way in which our social safety net works in community, it works in community. It was created in the early 1600s. And so when we think about the poor laws that were established in the 1600s, that was essentially creating the safety net that we currently still use today. And it was largely based on this culture of need, how much need a community has, or how much need an organization within community has, largely dominated how funding and the way money moved. And so largely for most of the existence of our safety net and the organizations that were within it, organizations essentially tallied up how much need they would have in a community, and that ultimately would sway and shift the way in which dollars would be resourced towards that, mostly public, but certainly philanthropic. And so you could see that by just walking into a social service agency. If you've ever been somebody who's filled out a form, largely those forms are 12 to 24 pages long, and there isn't any questions within those forms that say, what is good about the person who needs services. It's largely dictated on the idea that the more problems or challenges you have, the more aim are to getting services. And so about 20 years ago, you can now call it this kind of industry of nonprofits. The nonprofit sector started to take, and it's been around for a while, but it really started to take a turn towards using data and evaluation to help the sector. I wouldn't say help, but the sector started to move towards saying, well, the more you can count and show that you're making change, the more valuable you are. And so you started to see these words like strategic philanthropy. You started to see the rises in infrastructure toward adding and counting things to show that you were making a difference in your community. The challenge with that is, one, is that philanthropy was often within community dictating the way in which communities would be valued by their data, saying, well, the more that you can count this, the more money we will give. And what that also did in turn is took communities away from essentially what is their own right and their ability to own their own North Star and determine what they view as value as their way to make change in their community. We started to see in nonprofit boardrooms, board members saying, well, we've got to watch our mission only as valuable as how we can start to measure it. And you started to see philanthropy just say, I'm new in philanthropy, but even early on in my tenure, we would have organizations come in and say, hey, we are valuable because look at our charts. And that was always off-putting to me because they're way more valuable than the way they think they should be counting to myself as a philanthropic leader. And so at the foundation, T. Rowe Price Foundation, we believe that communities should be dictating and choosing their North Star and how they believe they should be measuring to get there. We think that organizations should be saying this is where we want to go and they should be measuring to it. We just believe that it's not our job to be telling them what they should be measuring, that they should be learning communities that are doing how they should be getting there, and we should be, as a philanthropy, developing structures and infrastructure to helping them do that. And so that's largely how we view data evaluation and how we use data and evaluation to get to where we need to be. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Jamye, I will turn things over to you to respond.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, Danielle, John. Yeah, both great introductions to this work and to this conversation around data. Danielle talked about sort of who collects data and what data. For me, I'm thinking what data is centered. And it reminds me of Michelle Alexander, who wrote a book called The New Jim Crow. And she's a young lawyer, Stanford graduate, and she's working for the ACLU in Oakland. And she's riding through Oakland and she sees a sign on the street corner that says mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow. And she's like, that's like rather extreme. And of course, years later, she writes The New Jim Crow. And I say that to say, like, the community already had an analysis. The community already had the data. The community had already, 20 years before The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, the community had this data. So for me, it's important that it's hard for this data for me to be important and real if we aren't in relationship with community. So to Daniel's point, like, who has the ability to collect data, whose data is being centered, and then how do we go about doing this work? So for me, collectively, I guess to introduce collectively, we launched in 2019 to be a resource for those that seek to find, fund, and partner with Black social change organizations. Some of our work comes out of Baltimore Uprising, as one of the co-founders of Baltimore United for Change, along with Leaders Beautiful Struggle, Algebra Project, Heber Brown, the Black Church Food Security Network. And one of the things we did then was sort of from this, going to what John talked about, this sort of deficit model, we came with a more asset-based framework and said, what are the skills and tools and values that already exist in our community? And we launched the Skills Bank, where we had over 260 individuals and organizations join this Skills Bank. I'm a mental health professional, I'm a lawyer, I'm a graphic designer, I'm a videographer. And how do we build off of the assets that already exist? How do we center Black genius? How do we center those who are most impacted by the issues and see them as leaders? And so I pull a lot of my sort of research and data from AFBI. It's a document on the case for funding Black-led organizations, which really speaks about Black-led infrastructure, that we must build Black-led infrastructure, that the reality is many of our organizations don't have the type of infrastructure to sustain their work. Even Baltimore United for Change is a sort of grassroots response to the murder of Freddie Gray, with no funding on the table, just us coming together with our collective assets and responding, and even collectively as a model, starting with the tools that we have, a volunteer effort, try to respond to the needs in our community. So for me, again, I'm centering assets. I'm looking at this philanthropic data around sort of the $60 billion in foundations that Black-led organizations get about 2% of that, and saying how do we sort of create a network approach to strengthening Black-led organizations, giving them greater capacity to do the work. I'll stop there.
Awesome, Jamie. I want to pause for a second and take a look at the chat box for questions. Lots of questions in the chat box. I'm reading something that says, wondering if we could replace the term white supremacy. Constantly repeating supremacy in our movements, I feel continues to give the terrorism, violence, colonization, and its believers power. If this is not the space, I think this is a great avenue to discuss this. Of course, we're just going to keep it brief. There's more ground to cover, and we can talk about this in a whole workshop. But this is something that was brought to my attention earlier this week, actually. I think it's true, and semantics does matter. But I also think that the way in which we understand issues matters as well. So someone told me, instead of white supremacy, maybe we can just be explicit about what white supremacy is, which is terrorism, domination, pathology, and exploitation. And I think that being very explicit about that eliminates that sort of veil in understanding the issue and promotes a more critical understanding. So thank you for raising that. And I don't know if any of our panelists have some commentary. So I'll pause for any commentary. No.
I'll jump in too. I think Danielle, actually, you posted a piece not that long ago about that sort of white inferiority complex. I believe was the terminology, right? Because this is something that really, which I love, right? Because this is a system that emerges from hurt people, right? This is not a system of love, of abundance, where there's enough for all of us to go around. And so this idea of supremacy is the wrong idea. This really is the idea of a broken people, of a people who don't necessarily see themselves as whole, because you don't create these type of systems. I tell my children, like, if I'm superior to you, I'll give you a head start, and I know I'll still beat you to the end of the street. But white supremacy does the opposite of that. It creates these notions of supremacies, but then creates all sorts of obstacles to keep us from achieving our goals. So I'll yield to Danielle, but I think that white inferiority complex is something that I prefer more.
Yeah, exactly. So I couldn't agree more with Jamie. I think it is important to use what language we have as we continue to reshape language to describe what we mean explicitly. And so I actually appreciate and want to acknowledge the importance of leading with that framing, Yinka, because in so many cases when we've had these dialogues, it's in the absence of actually being explicit about the frames in which, where these practices have their rooting. And if we're not more honest about where these practices and ways of being and ways of working have their rooting, we can never get to a real honest and effective solution. It was a colleague yesterday in another meeting stated something that really stuck with me, and I had to reflect on this a bit. He said that, you know, the practice of colonization in particular was the first global enterprise. It was the first real, like, global way of making money. And when you actually think about the tie between the practice and the systems and everything that spurred out of colonization, and you think about that tie with white supremacy and like this conversation around data, one thing that's really important for us to be honest about is this practice of extraction from communities of color, and being socialized in such a way that there's not always that part of us that says, oh my gosh, like, how is it that we do this so often? And we feel okay that something that, like, a sense of urgency doesn't, like, that kind of, I would say, an alarm doesn't sound off to say that absolutely not, that is not okay in terms of practice. But so often what we see in the field of research and evaluation, and quite honestly, what we often support as philanthropists or for folks working in foundations, are research efforts that do exactly that. We see researchers go into our communities, they extract information, they represent that information, often make a lot of money off of that information, build careers off of that information, and never think to give back, right? Never think to reinvest, or never think to acknowledge like what the true origin of that information was. Going back to Jamye's point, that notion that the data and the insight already exists. How often have we seen that process play out where someone just says, hey, let's just get together for let's be thought partners, let's host a convening, like tell me your best thinking about this particular issue, and all you do is simply take from that space and then represent that in a nice shiny report and a set of webinars, right? So what we're talking about, like that set of practices and that way and that culture of feeling okay with that, is what we're trying to get to the root of. And the naming of white supremacy, or as termed by Jamye and in that piece that I shared, the white inferiority complex, it's not a critique on anyone. It's actually to say that these are systems that were intentionally designed for very, very explicit purposes. And we're talking about like capitalistic gain. And when we start to understand it in that way, we can actually think about it a little bit more objectively and say, if these systems and ways were designed to accomplish certain ends, then certainly we as a people can come together, understand that, and then deconstruct those systems and ways and construct a new, more generative way of working. And that's what this is all about. And so I just wanted to offer that perspective as well.
Phenomenal, thank you. I want to make a connection to what we're seeing now in our communities and what we saw in 2015 during the uprisings. Folks are drawing a lot of parallels to that time and the foundations community response during that time and even now. Can you all offer some thoughts about how foundations are using data differently, the same? How are they using the data in our communities to shape their grant making differently than 2015 and now, or maybe it's the same?
Well, I can start. I have to say I don't see data being used or evaluation being used that much differently. I have to be honest. I do see some good seedlings or some good roots and shoots in some areas, but I think back to before I came to Baltimore in 2015. I did a lot of work with Philanthropy in New York City, and I remember in a meeting with 8 lead poverty funders in New York City, asking them, and they all asked for and look for quarterly reports from their grantees. They had massive amounts of data being sent to them on a routine basis, and I said, you're getting a lot of data. What are you seeing? And what the responses were they didn't know. And I think there's a really great article by the Stanford Social Innovation Review that's probably a decade old that was basically saying that philanthropy is drowning in data and not using that data as learners, right? We can also think about this in terms of universities going into community, oftentimes kind of weaponizing data on the backs of folks that live in those communities for their own ends, but often taking that data away from them. And so what I heard when I came to Baltimore was communities expressing really massive amounts of dissatisfaction with being used that way. And I would say that, at least from my end, data should be leading organizations and communities to change practice to be better, but to create a community of learners that are using that, right? Most nonprofits or folks that are doing this work don't have R&D departments. They're not creating infrastructure to be able to do this. But they are amazing learners. They are iterating in amazing ways. Yet we as an industry of folks are not using those learnings to help us be better, but also to learn from those communities to reshape practice. And so as I sit here today, could I say that we are better as a community as a community of learners? I'm not convinced that we could say that. And I think that's real unfortunate.
I tend to agree. I also would just add that I do see some growth. I think it's slight, as John has stated, is that there does seem to be a growing awareness that something has to change. Although I think that we are in the sector really, and I think I saw Jeff Solomon's question around like, what does it really take to get more foundations to think of themselves as learning organizations and shift their culture? The answer to that is that it does require a major culture shift. And what I see is that we have like some champions, right? So you have like John and Jamye and many others, Jess and her, position, like many who are situated in different institutions or in different parts of this work that carry a message that, look, we have to think about data in different ways. We need to adopt new and different frames for understanding data as a form of power in terms of access, and be responsible in the use of that power. And then we also need to think about distributing that power. But the extent to which we're shifting our institutions is still, I think, a question. But I think one solution is for us to continue to come together, and I think that's why these types of spaces are so important. Because in the absence of actually engaging in this type of dialogue and then grounding it in a very practical way to say, what can we practically do about this issue? We end up like moving and navigating through these issues solo. And we can only be but so effective working individually trying to tackle this. So what I've seen over the past couple of years, especially, are like very like interesting pilots, like, or individual investments in particular institutions or research efforts. We haven't taken the time to actually mine all of that information and to come together to, one, say that we actually have more folks in the philanthropic field that agree with this, right? And that this actually should represent a shift in the sector. I think that is a part of where we need to go. So the folks are out there, the dialogue is growing, but we definitely need to think about a way to come together more around a shift in our philosophy framework, and then also like a real conversation about what it would take to actually shift culture to create more room for this work,
Thank you for that. And that's actually a great segue into another question. And following up on the question that Jess Solomon has in the chat box here, she asks, how might foundations become learning organizations? What is the role of organizational culture? What are some tips and strategies? I think that folds really well into my question. So, the idea, as you just said, Danielle, being sort of individualistic in the approach and the learning and the sort of issues that creates. How can funders use data to work collaboratively during this time and beyond these crises we're experiencing, both within the funding community and across sectors? How can funders do that to better strengthen strategy and cohesion? Some things that are coming to mind for me is like a learning and practice community. What are your thoughts?
I think Jamye is leading the way, so I want to make room for Jamye to talk about how he's using Collectively as a platform to bring people together.
Thank you. For me, I mean, when I think about these sort of, like, my part of the goal with Collectively really is, how do we shift the center of gravity, right? How do we move it from the foundations having so much convening power and put it in the hands of community? So I think that there's a power imbalance, right? And so what happens, even if we come together, right, you're a funder and you're a community-based organization, and even if we say we're partnering, there's an issue of power. And for me, Dr. King said the ghetto and the plantation was both created by the powerful over the powerless. So fundamentally, this is a question of power in the conversations. Like, I hear, since 2015, I definitely hear language changing, right? So I'm hearing more people saying racial equity and having conversations that didn't happen 5 years ago or 10 years ago, where I think the shortfall still is power. Like, are we shifting resources in a very real way that gives communities the ability to be self-determined, right? Because for me, at the end of the day, it's about, can we be self-determined as a community? Can we set the priorities of our community? And so for me, a partnership with Foundation means, for me, giving up some of the power, sharing resources in a way that we are true partners in this conversation. But again, from a collectively standpoint, it's about how do we as a community center our own priorities, and then how do we have conversations where the community itself has already centered what is important to them.
Yeah. I'd like to add to Jamie's point is that I think this, the power is shared. It also could be taken or demanded. I think these power shifts happen very subtly and very sleight of hand. And they happen in ways in which a foundation may be giving a grant. It could be, whatever amount of money, it could be small. And the foundation says, I think you should measure this. And the organization says, cool, I want that. I need those dollars, and we're going to measure that way. Now, understanding that organization is sitting in that room representing many, many, many people on their shoulders. That foundation, should never ever say, you should measure this. That's not their space. They didn't earn that right? They need to listen first and understand that when that organization's sitting in the room, they are sitting there with hundreds and thousands of people potentially on those shoulders. And that organization comes to the table with what that foundation doesn't have, is that, which is community, right? And understanding that organization might need help getting, figuring out what is the framework by which they should be delivering those metrics, by saying, hey, we know we're working on this. There could be a conversation there, but it is not the foundation's role ever to say you should measure this. And that's what ends up happening all the time. And so I only bring up that sleight of measure, one, to illustrate where the foundation often steps wrong, but number two is that community, if they give up that power, shame on them, right? That they own that power and they should use it. They should say, I don't want to measure that, because that's not what my community values, right? That's not what's going to help us, right? And if they give up that power, which is done all the time, the second thing, and I'll stop here, is community data, which is a power, should be shared amongst organizations. And what we have found at the T. Rowe Price Foundation is that there's not a lot of sugar sharing between organizations, right? And the sharing of data, the sharing of knowledge, the sharing of learning amongst organizations and coming together around that only enhances and strengthens the power of community to not only take over the power within philanthropy, both private and government, but also allows you to command more space in that room if you're sharing and collecting data together, sharing those stories together, sharing those learnings together. Often data collection and the data is very siloed amongst organizations, and that's a power you could share and command more space with together.
Yeah, and I just want to add two notes that I think that a part of the work to be done is to in expanding our circle of concern in a way that really and a part of the I think the work of expanding our circle of concern is actually to look at data and the reality that our experiences and our health, our well-being, I mean, it's all tied together. We're interdependent, and so when we think about like the Baltimore region in particular, when you think about our economic future, you talk about housing, education, the future of our workforce, all of these like really important issues, the future of our leadership, political leadership. When we systematically disadvantage entire segments of our base of residents and people, we actually are hurting ourselves, and we're keeping Baltimore away from actually being the fully prosperous and thriving place that it actually can be. And so, you know, this work of expanding our circle, like sometimes in philanthropy, I remember when I initially started working in the sector, being really shocked to hear how we would talk about populations in Baltimore as though they were in other, like they're like something to be studied. There's something that we can kind of chart on, you know, on some type of graph, but we would almost externalize these dialogues in a way that, but they're not connected to us, rather than understanding that that young person that you're talking about in West Baltimore could be the person that you need to rely on tomorrow to save your life. You know what I mean? Like that young person is actually the solution, right? And so like when you start to actually think about it in that way, then we can't let that young person fail. Like absolutely not. So like this notion of getting more connected and actually seeing ourselves in relationship with each other in a different way. The second note that I wanted on this note of power, what I just wanted to make a note in terms of what really keeps us away from seeding and sharing power. And I actually going back to your initial framing, I think that the scarcity mindset, this notion that this is a zero-sum game, the notion that if I give you power, then I am taking away something from myself, rather than saying to build collective power actually enriches us all, is a mindset that we need to again study and understand, because it is rooted in a system that was intentionally created, and we need to get away from that. Because in philanthropy especially, like when I see my colleagues like really struggle with like, oh gosh, like, okay, we see the data, we see the information, like, so what am I going to do with it? Am I going to give up that portfolio? Am I going to give up that body of work that I built my career on? It's like almost this like fear that like, what is my interest in the alternative, right? And so we need to support conversations in which folks can actually see that, no, like you're giving up one thing, but in favor of something that is like so good, so much more effective, right? And so much better for us all, that we all in a new future that we can all could see ourselves in. That the alternative looks not only like it's in reach, but actually feels good and makes sense to us all. So, you know, it's just a note about like, you know, what keeps us away from actually ceding power and actually seeing that it is actually feasible to do that work.
Thank you. That was so powerful. I think, you know, when we think about change and transformation, folks often say, you know, what do I have to lose? I don't think we say or ask ourselves enough, what do we have to gain in shifting, in transforming? And what are those gains and how powerful they could be? We have a lot of questions in the chat that also talk about this idea of being in community, being in partnership, seeding power. But first I want to highlight something from Bonnie LeGros. So from One Foundation, just starting on re-examining equity in our grant making. We have been analyzing for the first time the internal data of who we are funding, how much we are funding, and how we are making the decisions about what work is effective. Lots more to do. I think that that is a great example. I want to tap into this idea of community, collective power. But first, could you all just share some ideas, some practices that foundations are taking on, maybe your organizations, that sort of do that internal analysis and offer some suggestions for others?
I'm happy to jump in since we're all looking at each other's sides of our screens. Well, I can only say, at least, you know, from one, as I would like to just piggyback on what Danielle said, just because it was so poignant. These systems are really, you know, the reason I started with history is that these systems have been created for a really long time. As we talk and reflect on data and evaluation, right? And again, if you're a person who is going into a social service office today in Baltimore City, there is a 27-page intake form, not one question on why that person is valuable. What do they do well? It's all built around what's wrong with them. There is no way that we can create meaningful social change in a dynamic like that. Industry our industry is built on the idea that you may get more dollars if it's worse today than it was yesterday, right? We've had folks come in, and our central premise as it comes to evaluation, and it gets to your question specifically, Yinka, is you tell us what's important to you. And we have had organizations come in and say, no, just tell us what we need to measure. Like, that'll make this go quicker. And we'll say, no, we don't. We're never, ever going to do that, because ultimately the roadway on that is going to be worse if we do that. We're looking for meaningful social change that is community owned and community led. And it can't happen in that way. And so we've created, there's a couple of tools that we have created in our pathway to allow communities and the organizations within those communities to choose their metrics and lead us. One is a group that's called the 1 Acre Fund, which is a group that works in Africa with women farmers. And they have a great dashboard process that we have retrofitted for our process that ultimately helps lead the dialogue around communities thinking about what are the metrics that are important to them. What is their North Star, and what do they think is important to them? And then we use a group out of Chicago called Mission Measurement. We kind of mesh together these two formats that ultimately allow community to develop a roadmap and allow us, what it ultimately does is not create a situation where we're watching them to say, aha, did you get your metrics? Because that's not what we're after. What we're after is a better conversation, a better learning for us and for them, and a better place for us to have a better back and forth that they ultimately own. And so those two tools, which we're happy to share with anybody that wants it, is a framework by which we use. The last thing we'll use, which is also owned by Mission Measurement, but if you go into the foundation's application, we use this thing called the Impact Genome. And the Impact Genome is ultimately something that we think is valuable because, one, what's challenging in this is that you don't know what best practice is, right? Everybody is a model, and we're not saying that you're not. But what we want is this network of folks that are in this genome so that you can say, I'm working on third grade reading or third grade literacy. Who's doing this around the world really well? And you could find them. You can find the best research that says what is the latest and greatest. Potentially, you can debate it on what's out there. We want our ecosystem to be looking at what's out there and grabbing that so that they therefore can have better discussions at home. And so we're using Impact Genome to help us do that.
I also want to offer that for, if I understand the question correctly, it's about ways of bringing like essentially an equity analysis into what data we're looking at as foundations, philanthropic institutions, and how we're making use. Is that right, Yinka?
Yep.
Okay. So when I think about first, I'll offer a few comments. Like first, like what data should we be talking about, like in terms of internal equity assessments for philanthropic institutions? One, it's certainly like your portfolios, like unpack, like I hear Bonnie in terms of like unpack those portfolios, look at like who you're investing at and at what level, on what terms, like what are the differences in the types of conditions that we attach with different types of grant agreements. Like that'll tell you a little bit about the quality of investment as well. So like really unpacking those portfolios to see what's there. But I also would say that it's not limited to that. So also as philanthropic institutions, very often, like we don't think of ourselves as like economic engines, like the institution itself, and the importance of looking at other aspects of the institution and the power that sits there. So like, asking questions around like what services do we procure, and from what local businesses? Are we actually engaging local small businesses, minority owned businesses to create more economic access and different types of opportunities? Who are we hiring on, and on what terms? Are we actually using our power as philanthropic institutions to think differently about how we think about human capital and talent? And are we looking for diversity there? Also, how we communicate, like what's our message and who are we speaking to? That's an important part of an internal equity assessment, because all of this is about information, data, and how it's actually used by foundations. So that's just one thing I'd offer. Then there's a question of, okay, like, well, then we do the analysis, or we want to do the analysis, but how do we do it? And what capacities do we need to think about in order to do it well? Well, one thing I would offer is that we shouldn't do it alone. So very often what we'll do in philanthropy is that we go to the boardroom and we collect what information we have access to in good intention. And this is not to say that we shouldn't start there, because if that's what we have to work with, absolutely start where you are. But we have to understand that pulling those reports and like the population level and neighborhood level data, the articles and all of this, and then going into the boardroom with the same people is not the same as thinking about who can actually partner with you and actually looking at that data and interpreting it. Because even when I think about the early days of the youth fund, like the powerful thing there was that when we actually compiled the data, like we had 1,200 unique data points, like unique recommendations from residents around the city. When we thought about how to actually pull that data together and interpret that data, we decided to do that through an allied structure. So we actually had a partnership of about 30 young people with allied adults come into a room and unpack that data. And it was mind-blowing. Like the ways that young people, so what they saw in that information was so dramatically different from what we interpreted as adults or from just different lived experience, that it really underscored the importance of making sure that we think about diversity even in the room, like when we're actually going through a process of analysis, and also thinking about a level of facilitative support to help us to probe and push us in the way that we think. And then I'll offer that, like, you know, in terms of some practical, like, you know, like platforms that we can think about, I'd have to lift up collectively, like Jamie's here and doing excellent work. A lot of times, like in grant making, we are very infatuated with the big investments. We talk a lot about big impact, but we don't talk about the power of like smaller investments in the aggregate as much, but we see a lot of movement and power around those platforms. Small grants also, or more modest grant sizes, also have a lot of power, and we should think about how to use that not only as to develop a more diverse pipeline of organizations that are in line for resources, but also as a very important data collection tool. What is great about Jamye and Collectively and other similar platforms is that there's so much depth of insight that comes from who's been invested in through those platforms and what they're lifting up. So I just wanted to kind of lift up those thoughts in terms of like this notion of an equity assessment and how we may think practically about how to apply that in philanthropic institutions.
Thank you. We have a lot of wonderful questions and comments about authentic partnership, given, you know, power imbalances that exist between funders and nonprofit communities. I would love for you all to speak to that. And actually, we have a question for Jamye about the process you use at Collectively to award solidarity funds. I think that, you know, you just said it, Danielle, the Collectively model is a really great example of authentic community partnership and collective impact. So maybe could you just talk about your process, and then the rest of the panelists, if you could just share some thoughts about authentic partnerships, seeding power to create true collective power.
Yes, thank you. Well, we started again in 2019 with the Black Futures Micro Grant, which is a monthly micro grant of $1,000 where you submit a 2 to 3 minute video online and the community at large votes for the winner. So the first year we had over 20,000 votes. So the community was engaged. It was also meant to be somewhat disruptive in the sense of like, yeah, you can give Black folks $1,000 unrestricted. And you know, I always say invest in impact, like invest in folks who are doing the work, and then we can go get the data. But like first invest in impact. And so the community has chosen great organizations, and we sort of reimagined the Black Futures Micro Grant to form the Baltimore Black-led Solidarity Fund to respond to COVID. And also what we're finding more and more, that many of the organizations are community-based organizations, no business structure, so might not be on the nonprofit radar, are LLCs. So a lot of organizations are LLCs, and they're, you know, have little faith in the foundation community and have always been doing social impact work, but knew they had to have a revenue generating model to even sustain this work. And so I think the LLC is the community-based organization, even our businesses that I see as anchors that are doing, again, have goods and services, but are also serving the community, are often not on the radar. So we use this sort of participatory model. We did not have an application process for the Baltimore Black-led Solidarity Fund. I have advisory board, and then we have other community partners that have recommended folks for us to support. We did not want to create a sort of forum that said, you know, show me your need, show me how you've been impacted, you know, how much money have you lost? So we did a survey around folks who had to counsel programming, counsel events, and things of that nature. But we didn't want to do this sort of charity-based model, and that's why we say solidarity, not charity. This was really a way, knowing some of this racial wealth gap information, that it would take us 228 years to close this gap. Obviously, we didn't need more data. We knew that our organizations would need support during COVID, and that's how we responded, as a way of just honoring and uplifting those that we've been in partnership with to support their work.
Yinka, I might just real quickly, because I know we only have 5 minutes, but the thing I would add on to both what Danielle and Jamye have said is I think we're missing out also on the importance and what can be destructive in governance, right? The boards, both of nonprofits and in philanthropy, we got to remember that when the nonprofit sector started, boards were a community organizing model. It was citizens coming together around an issue that they cared about and organized around that. And what's happened over time, and especially over the last 20 years, our boards have lost their way in that regard. And within that have become places, you know, you started to hear 20 years ago, more and more, nonprofits should be more like business. Now, I work for a business that I think is great. I don't think nonprofits should be more like business. Nonprofits are created to be a community amalgam coming together around that. And unfortunately, we've lost that. And I think if we can get back to that, then organizations can be more authentic. The last thing I would say is, for funders specifically, is if you want to have authentic partnerships in community, you have to first be good listeners, and you have to be willing to be led. We had a number of companies approach us recently and said, we'd love to learn, and we'd love your playbook, quote unquote, about what your work was in West Baltimore. We said, do you know how super offensive it is to want a playbook, to want to learn? Your first job is to listen. And if you don't know how to listen, that's where you need to start. And so for us, being authentic in community starts by, one, being good listeners, and two, you have to, from a foundation standpoint, you have to be willing to be led.
Definitely. And I would just add that it's about honesty. So honesty about what we are there to do. So sometimes what I see us do as funders is that we'll enter into community settings and we'll use transformative language when we're actually there for transaction. And I think that it is okay to actually be honest when your only role there is to facilitate the transaction and get out of the way. And then to be honest when you actually are looking for a different level of depth in terms of relationship, a long-term relationship, a more authentic relationship, which is about transformation. But we should not conflate the two. I also think that a part of building trust is about presence. And as we talk about data and how it is applied in a philanthropic context, we have to talk about experiential learning. That means you have to get out and into community settings so that you can feel and sense and kind of like just be immersed into the settings that this information comes from. Because there's only but so much you can glean from reading about these issues on paper. There's so much that you pick up intuitively and otherwise by being in the present and being in community with people, and there's no replacement for that. And that is my hope and aspiration for the philanthropic sector, that we are more willing to take the risk and humble ourselves to actually show up a bit more, and then also be honest about what we don't know in that work. And so it's okay sometimes to say, you know what, this is my intent, but as John has lifted up, I'm here to be a student. And as we're talking about, I'm on this path of learning. And to be honest in that, and you'd be surprised, like people always show up, you know, and will pull you forward if you're being honest and authentic in that.
Thank you. We are at time, but before we close, I just want to thank our panelists and just go over some brief highlights and takeaways from this. So, solidarity, not charity, being internally focused, before moving externally in your racial equity assessment and analysis, being rooted authentically in community priorities, transformation over transaction, honesty, being immersed in community, you are the community, and just continue to be a lifelong learner as some lessons for our foundation community. I think that that is so wonderful. Thank you to all who have joined this discussion today. I have to sing the praises of these wonderful panelists. You have done such a wonderful job. So thank you, thank you. And I'm
Likewise, thank you, Yinka.
Wrap us up.
Awesome
Thank
job,
you
as
all.
always. Thank you for
Did
having
an
us.
amazing job as moderator. We're going to take your final assessments and maybe like post it on the wall.
Thanks to our wonderful audience as
Thanks
well.
for
Yeah, it was fun.
everybody. And yeah, you had a rock star audience as well as a rock star
Yes,
panel.
wonderful group.
Thanks for being our 16th session at Baltimore Data Week. We are headed to 20. Number 17 is
Wow,
coming up
amazing.
next. If you want to learn all about how to use census data, we've got the Census Bureau coming up at 11:30. Thank you all so much. Have a great
Thank you,
rest of your
guys.
day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.